There's some seats in through the front. You want to come up? Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Gillian Robinson. I'm Director of ARK, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this ARK seminar today. Just before we go on to the topic of the seminar, some of you may be unfamiliar with ARK, and just to tell you that ARK is a joint resource set up to open up access to social and political information in Northern Ireland. We are involved in a range of work, including an attitudinal survey series, policy research resources, and a fairly major dissemination and outreach programme. The seminar series forms part of that, and through our seminars we aim to bring together a variety of people with an interest in a particular topic. So that could include students, policymakers, voluntary and community sector workers, people working in government, politics or whatever. So we bring together a range of people with an interest in a topic and have a short presentation from someone with expert knowledge on the subject, and then hopefully a fairly lively debate and discussion around whatever the topic is. So we're very delighted to see a wide range of people here today, and you're very, very welcome indeed. As I said, the format for the seminar is that our speaker will speak for about 25-30 minutes, and then we have an open forum for discussion. After the seminar, we move outside where there's a light lunch served, and you're welcome to continue the conversation out there. Today we're very fortunate to have with us Dr. Neil Jarman from the Institute for Conflict Research. Many of you may know Neil, but he and his colleagues in the Institute have been engaged in a wide range of conflict-related research, including a lot of work on race and diversity over the years. So we were delighted when he took up our invitation to look at some of the Life and Times survey data on attitudes to race and minority ethnic groups, and to present this seminar for us. So we're very, very pleased that he has taken time to do that, and we're looking forward to hearing what he has to say. I have to make one apology. The research update that you've received today, just last night we found an error. You never find it on the first proof, second proof or third proof. And we've marked it, I think, on all the hard copies that you have, but basically the column headings on table 1 should be the other way around. Neil will refer to that when he speaks to you. We will be getting new copies printed, but the correct PDF version is already available on the ARK website, and there will be hard copies if any of you need hard copies. So apologies about that. I should also say that Neil will be speaking from the Life and Times survey series data. The modules on attitudes to minority ethnic people have been funded by the Office of the First Minister, Deputy First Minister over the past number of years, and we're very grateful to them for their support of the survey. So without any further ado, I'll invite Neil to make his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gillian. Good morning, afternoon, everybody. There was a bit of a shock last night about 5:30 when I was doing my final run through the facts for the PowerPoint to realise that one of my statements didn't sort of match up with what was said on the figures. It was entirely my fault. I just hadn't checked it all through, so apologies for that. It will be correct when it appears on the PowerPoint. I've been told to stand still for this, so I'm stuck here. Prejudice and tolerance. This is really looking at the data on racism and racist prejudice within Northern Ireland. And I think that's one of the issues that's been widely publicised through the media as the growing problems of racism within Northern Ireland in recent years. We've had the various statements about Belfast being the race hate capital of Europe, and there's no denying that there is a problem here. This graph shows the police stats for racist incidents over the last 10 years, which shows a fairly significant increase from about 2003 onwards, plateauing off over the last couple of years at around the 1,000 incidents a year mark. This steep rise from about 2003 coincides at the same time with the increase in the minority communities, the range and the number of the minority communities in Northern Ireland. I'd have to say that until we get the next set of census figures, we won't really know very much or have a clear indication of the scale of the minority communities. The 2001 figures, which is all we've got, completely out of date. We're running on updates on data from NICVA in terms of the numbers of people coming and registering under the Workers' Registration Scheme as new migrants to Northern Ireland. But we don't really know what the baseline anymore is of the number of people. But what we do know is that there is a scale in terms of the problems of racism, which must be underpinned by prejudicial attitudes. And it's those attitudes that we're going to be exploring through this discussion. And doing it from two ways, one of which is perceptions of prejudice in general, what people think of other people's levels of prejudice, what people think of levels of prejudice in Northern Ireland more generally, and then a sense of understanding of their own levels of prejudice, or how far people are prepared to admit that they are prejudiced towards members of minority communities. So I'm going to look at through both those strands, beginning with the sense of perceptions of prejudice in general. And all this data is really coming from the 2008 survey, with some comparative material when I introduce it will come in from the previous surveys. So what we've got is that 93% of the population think that there is some level of prejudice towards members of minority communities. 44% of the population think that there is a lot of prejudice, and just 7% think there's hardly any. I mean, in some senses, that's sort of stating the blindly obvious. Yes, there is prejudice because there's lots of hate crime, but the fact that people are prepared to admit it, or admit that they believe that this is the case, I think is fairly significant. And the other way of this is that people think that there is less respect towards members of the minority communities than there have been in previous years. 44% agree or strongly agree that there is less respect to members of the minority communities. I think these two things go hand in hand. If you're respecting those communities, you're less likely to experience prejudice towards them, and vice versa. So that we can look at them both the positive and the negative sides of it here. However, if we open it up a bit, and this table from over previous years in terms of which communities do people think there's most prejudice against, we can see that there is certainly an understanding that when we talk about minority ethnic communities, we're not talking about a homogenous group. We are talking about different constituencies, different backgrounds, different faiths, and all kinds of different communities in there. And therefore attitudes may change and may reflect changes in engagement. And I think you can see here the way the perceptions of prejudice against the different communities has been changing over recent years. For example, I think the perceptions of prejudice directed towards the Chinese community has dropped considerably between 2005 and 2008. 2005, people identified the Chinese as the most prejudiced against community. Now, they're about the lowest. You know, I think one of the things that this type of survey material throws up is questions that we need to go and look at more. Why have those attitudes towards the Chinese community changed so much? It does coincide with the period when Anna Lowe has become more prominent within the community as being elected to the Assembly as an MLA. It does represent perhaps a rise in the acceptance of the Chinese community as fully integrated as part of within Northern Irish society. So that might be a perception that's there. I think you can also see the rise in perceived prejudice towards the Polish community, reflecting the fact that that community has only recently been established. There was no figures in 2005. They were incorporated broadly within the Eastern European figures. But now most people recognise high levels of prejudice towards the Polish community. And if you look at PSNI data on which communities are experiencing the most severe forms of hate crimes, the published data is not published, but I got the figures from the PSNI a couple of days ago, that nearly 25% of recorded hate crimes, racist hate crimes, are directed at the Polish community, far more than any other community in Northern Ireland, any other nationality in Northern Ireland. So we can see the change in patterns almost, if you like, there between decreasing perceived prejudice towards the Chinese, increased in perceived prejudice towards the Polish community. At the bottom there, you can see the first time the question was asked in relation to the Romanian community, When this survey's done next year, I wouldn't be at all surprised, given the incidents in South Belfast earlier this year in terms of attacks on the Roma community, that figure doesn't rocket. The one other figure I would draw attention to, and this will be a sub-theme, I think, running through this presentation, is in relation to travellers. That they are second placed always, constantly, as being perceived as being discriminated against. And this the figure, the perceptions and relationships with the travellers run through the literature and run through the data on this in this sense. You know, if I've said that maybe the Chinese community, the perceptions of prejudice towards the Chinese community is going down because of perhaps increased levels of integration within society, high level profile, the travellers are the longest standing minority community in Northern Ireland and in Ireland more generally, and yet they remain the most marginalised and most discriminated against and most prejudiced against. And I think these figures come out of here. Okay, if we move on now to presentations of people's own sense of prejudice. This table, this graph, asks people, the findings from asking people how far they were prejudiced against members of the minority communities. And we can see here that the figures go from 11% of people in 1994 who admit that they were either prejudiced or very prejudiced against minority communities, increasing to 25% in 2005, to 35% in 2007, and dropping down to just 32%, or down to 32% in 2008. So that's 1 in 3 of the population admitting publicly that they are prejudiced or very prejudiced against members of minority communities. And I think you can see that there becomes to be a correlation almost. If you look in that graph with the figures in terms of rising race in incidents, there's a similar sorts of trajectory over the last few years. But if we ask, who are these people who are prejudiced? This is the top bit, is just saying, okay, that's the basic figures. 32% admit to being prejudiced. Men are slightly more prepared to admit to being prejudiced than women, 35% as opposed to 30%. And then Protestants, 41% admit to being prejudiced, as opposed to 24% of no religion and 23% of Catholics. Well, we can also see fairly significant increases in each of those areas, with the gap between Protestants admitting prejudice as opposed to Catholics admitting prejudice has expanded since 2005. And I think that there's stark questions there which really need to be raised and explored as to why these levels of prejudice are perhaps becoming increasing, and people willing to admit to their prejudice, why there are higher numbers of Catholics, and why that gap is between Catholics and other religions or no religions is increasing. It's a worrying figure, and that sense of the unevenness of the prejudice, or perceived approved prejudice or recognised prejudice, why that's opening up, and why is it more so within the Protestant community than within the Catholic community. The questionnaire also asked about how, if you feel prejudiced towards members of minority communities, do you try specifically to avoid conveying that sense of prejudice, or do you not try to convey a sense of prejudice? So 84% of people said that they admitted they were prejudiced, but they tried to disguise it or to try to not to display it to members of minority communities. But more worryingly, again, 15% do not try to disguise their prejudice. They're prepared to be upfront about it. They'll express it to people. So that's a sizable minority. And what you always find with these, even if here we're talking in percentages, and it's 15% of those 33% or 32% who express prejudice. That's a sizable number of people across Northern Ireland. And it doesn't take very many people to act out their prejudices to create a real problem. So we're getting some interesting data there to sort of the number of people who admit to being prepared to be actively racist and convey that racism to people. Again, men are more likely than women to act out there, be prepared to display their attitudes. Interestingly, the 35 to 44-year-old age range was the least prepared to display their prejudices. And the slightly older age range was more so. Perhaps that's a kind of counterintuitive. You kind of think of young people perhaps generally being more positive, being more exposed to a more range of diverse communities in more settings. But it doesn't seem to be the case there. And then again, Protestants are more willing to, well, not less willing to disguise their prejudice than Catholics. So similar sort of patterns emerging throughout. Again, if we look at the question about whether people are prepared to integrate, 26% say they prefer to stick with their own kind rather than moving towards integration. And we'll move on to levels of integration in a few seconds. Again, males are more than females, Protestants more than Catholics. The patterns build up. I mean, I think if you get one set of figures which indicates something, you can draw on it. But if you build up that data on a number of different variables, and here in terms of prefer to stick to their own kind, 1 in 3 Protestants would prefer to stick to their own kind, whereas less than about 1 in 5 of Catholics. In this question, the people were asked how far they would be prepared to accept members of different ethnic groups in different categories of relationship. So the 4 categories were there was a broad Chinese stroke Asian group, East Europeans, Muslims and Irish travellers. And then they were asked whether they'd be willing to accept them as a colleague, as a resident in the near locality to where they live, would they accept them as a friend, and whether they would accept them as someone who a close relative was married to, as an in-law. And what you can see from here is that across the board, that we're happier with the more distant relationships, but the closer the relationships get to us, we're less comfortable with. So people are quite generally happier to have someone as a colleague at work than they are as someone living close to their house, or as a friend, or as an in-law. And then you can also see very real patterns of difference between the 4 categories of groupings, with again much more negative attitudes towards travellers than towards any of the other communities. And when you think about the publicity that's been going on about the Muslim community and the hostility that's been expressed in the media and the suspicion and fear that's ripped up through the media generally across the UK towards Muslims, you know, it says to me something about the scale of residual antipathy towards travellers within this society, that they are, you know, they're the only group that be getting below 50% in terms of people willing to engage with them. And interestingly, you know, the residential status, people just don't want to be living near to travellers. I mean, that's a very worrying situation because travellers are already kind of the marginalised of the marginalised within this community. So I think that to me is, I can think you can see, take very real positives from the engagement with the Chinese and attitudes towards Chinese and Asian communities, the most long-standing communities in Northern Ireland, but very worrying issues around the traveller community. And then when we move this graph onto the breaking it down by Protestant and Catholics, we can see, again, across the board, in every category, about a 10% difference between attitudes within the Catholic community and attitudes within the Protestant community. So very real differences across the board there. Exploring this issue about whether people actually have relationships. The previous sets of questions was about whether they would consider relationships with it. It's a hypothetical question in this sense. Would you accept? Would you be willing to? Not have you. We now move on to the have you got. And you can see that it's possibly easier to be hypothetically willing to have a colleague or a friend from another community. If you haven't got one, it's like, oh, I quite like the idea of, and I can accept that one. But the reality of it is that relatively limited levels of engagement with different minority communities, highest numbers with work colleagues amongst Poles, What's interesting to me here, and I'm not really got any clues as to why this is, but given that the previous table, which was showing a decline steadily across from the closeness of the relationship between colleagues, residents and friends, that very few people appear to have members of minority communities as neighbours. Now, that seems to me quite surprising, that is so low, that there's fewer people having them as neighbours than as friends. But again, some of these issues raise questions, I think, when you've got just the hard data to work with, that you want the qualitative data to go out and investigate the flesh on some of these bones. Again, I would just simply reiterate the very low figures for actual engagement with travellers, actual integration in any sense of forms of meeting travellers, of associating with them. Much lower than any of the other communities. There are different patterns in those data, in that sense of data, though, as well. It's not across the board, and there are quite some different. Generally, in all those categories, or many of those categories, Protestants seem to have more contact with people as work colleagues. They seem to admit to having more friends from different minority communities, whereas Catholics have got them living in the neighbourhood. And that again seems to be different from the data that we've had before, because our understanding of a lot of the data is that members of minority communities have been tending to live in Protestant working class areas because that's where the housing has been available. That's what the data previously has been telling us. But this data seems to suggest that few people admit to having people living in their neighbourhoods, and Catholics admit to it more than Protestants. Now, they're not huge numbers, but it does seem to be against our understanding of, and I don't know how far that's made up by the numbers of Poles moving into it and perhaps living more in Catholic areas than Protestant areas. But again, it seems to raise questions that we need to look at, perhaps challenging some of our existing understandings. So in terms of people's levels of integration, approximately 30% of people say that they have a daily contact with members of minority communities, which appears to be quite positive, once or twice a week for 26%. But when we looked at the next level of that data, which was what form did that contact take, for 45% of the people, it was just little more than a greeting, a passing in the street, a contact in the shop, a nod, a hello, not really very substantial engagement. Only about 22% of people said they had lengthy conversations was the form of engagement they had. So it was relatively superficial. But again, there is some level of contact there. We're getting to the end here, just whipping through a couple more points. The survey asked if you agreed with the question, the statement. I personally know quite a bit about the culture of some BME communities. So we got 25% of people agree or strongly agree, feel they know something about at least one of the minority communities, but 37% disagree. So there is a sense there that there's not an awful lot of knowledge. What we're seeing is aspirationally people are willing to consider closer relationships with people, but in practice it hasn't really developed yet. And where it has developed, it's relatively superficial, and there isn't an awful lot of understanding of those cultures developing from that interaction. So it appears to be a relatively distant set of relationships, which, given the kind of levels of segregation that we have within the Protestant and Catholic communities, given the levels of barriers that we know exist and through sectarianism, it is perhaps not surprising. And what was felt there, though, I suppose the positive side is that the younger age groups felt they had more understanding of other cultures than the older age groups. And it was, every age group was slightly, older age group was slightly less than the one before. So the positive side of it you take is that younger age groups do feel they're getting more of an understanding of those other cultures that are living and present in Northern Ireland than the older age groups. But again, the Protestant community feeling that they have less knowledge than the other communities. Okay, just summing up the key points here. Firstly, nearly 1 in 3 people are admitting racial prejudice. That figure is increasing fairly significantly over the last few years. Perhaps more worryingly, 1 in 6 of people who are prejudiced are not afraid to disguise it. They're prepared to admit it in public to people. Protestants and men generally are more likely to admit prejudice across the board than Catholics and women. That in terms of relationships, the idea of relationships with members of minority communities, people are happier if those relationships are kept at a distance. They're less welcoming of the thought of very close interpersonal relationships with members of minority communities. But it is perhaps also based on a limited level of engagement, a limited level of interaction, and a limited understanding of other cultures. And I think the final point I would make here is that this survey raises a number of key issues, a number of interesting points, but it also raises for me questions that we want to investigate, because whilst it's interesting to find out these levels of data, it's worrying the scale of prejudice that is around in Northern Ireland, and we need to find ways of engaging with that. We need to find ways of interrogating people more deeply about their perceptions, their understandings, their behaviours, and find ways of engaging with that more productively so that we can reduce those levels of racist incidents. And I think perhaps one of the most positive things come out of it is the last sense that younger people are certainly feeling a greater understanding for the minority communities, the other cultures that are now an established part of life in Northern Ireland. And perhaps that gives us a platform, a basis that we can build on in developing anti-racist programmes, either through community work, through education, or through school. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, Neil. Such a lot of information, and I think I was very pleased you were able to find something positive at the end, because a lot of the information does seem to be very negative. And of course, one of the questions we always get asked about attitude surveys are people telling you the truth? But I think most of what Neil was reporting today, when you looked at some of the time series data, seems to bear witness to our everyday experience and what we're hearing in the news. So I think the data seems to be robust. I think there are some very important challenges there for us. And I know many of you are working in the area and deeply involved, so I'm looking forward to opening up the floor to your questions now or comments. If you just want to raise your hand, we can offer you the floor. We are recording the seminar, which will go on the ARK website later on this week. So if you don't mind, if you have a question, if you just wait to speak into the mic, it doesn't magnify, but it records to the video. Okay, so just hold on. I'll move this over to us. Okay. So is there anyone who'd like to open the questions? Yes.
Hello, thank you very much for a very interesting talk, despite its pessimism, I guess. I was wondering, why do you think that the Protestants are more likely to admit that they are prejudiced against other minorities? Because it is quite a striking difference between them. And the immediate question is, is a matter of, is this a difference that has to do with disclosure of prejudice, or is this the fact that they are more, they report to being more prejudiced than the Catholics? So I was wondering what your thoughts are on this.
Okay. Sorry, just before Neil speaks, I think we'll take 2 or 3 questions, and then there may be other people with a variation on that theme that want to fill into that debate before Neil responds. Sorry, that makes it harder for you.
I would just like to ask, given the nature of residential segregation in Belfast and the very localised levels of contact with ethnic minorities, the information as to where, especially recently arrived ethnic minorities, are housed is surely crucial to see if it relates to the patterns, especially, and surely the housing executive could provide some of that information.
Okay, thank you.
I wonder if there is any correlation between the results that you've presented and educational attainment among those who you questioned, if you know.
Okay, I'll let Neil come back with some initial comments perhaps on some of that.
I'm going to duck the difficult one till last. Housing levels, yeah, Eric, yes, one would assume that if there's levels of opportunity for interaction, levels of contact, that might lead to more racism, more prejudice within certain communities than others, just from levels of interaction. I think we've got to some extent look at this issue in the wider context of Northern Ireland, and I don't think it's very easy at times to differentiate entirely racism from sectarianism. I think we often still focus on sectarianism, focus on racism because it's less uncomfortable than sectarianism, but there isn't an underlying culture in Northern Ireland in which prejudice towards an other community which is different is still acceptable in many areas, in many communities. We've seen various in the past understandings of homophobia. Did work last year on hate crime against people with disabilities, different forms of racism, religious violence or attacks on religious minorities. We're not a very nice society at times to people from minority communities, or perhaps put it another way, there are a substantial minority of people who are not very nice to members of minority communities, whether that's based on their race, their sexual orientation, their gender, whatever. We don't like people who are different, and that I don't think is that surprising, given that we've had 30-odd years of armed conflict in which the other has been a primary target, in which we've gone towards sense of making areas single identity, and therefore safer for us. And I think if you bring minority ethnic communities into that environment, and it's very easy for them to transfer your hostility, which might have been towards a Catholic or to a Protestant, towards someone else who is different, either because of their skin colour, because of their faith, because of their sexual orientation. And we're seeing that across the board, problems around prejudice. The difficulty is that we don't have a lot of data on a lot of these minority communities, whatever their basis. The Housing Executive don't have very good data. And also the Housing Executive only provides 16% of houses in Northern Ireland, so it's still a relatively small database to draw on. I think we kind of overemphasise the Housing Exec at some time. Yes, they have a substantial basis in social housing, but generally they don't have a high percentage of the total housing. And my experience from some of the communities that I've worked with over the years, they're not particularly in social housing. They're getting into the private sector. They're getting into private houses, or they're getting onto the property market and buying houses fairly early on because it makes sense. So that we are struggling to look at baselines of data. We are struggling to look at understand where people are living. And it will take us a bit of time to do that. You know, the census will be another, 3 years away, 2 years away, 3 years before the data comes out. We are struggling with that. We're reliant on anecdotal information. And what struck me from there was that, you know, the small number of people who were prepared to acknowledge the fact that their neighbours had neighbours from minority communities. You know, I thought there'd be more people acknowledging that, and I thought there'd be more people in Protestant areas. So it seems to suggest that our current understandings of it are different from what the data is throwing up. You know, we need to say, okay, well, we need to investigate that to some extent. There isn't very good, clear data on some of this information. Similarly, with education attainment, we didn't particularly focus on asking people their education attainment in here. We do know that when we look at where the incidents are occurring, the racist incidents are occurring, they tend to occur in working class neighbourhoods, and there tend to in the past been more in working class Protestant neighbourhoods than working class Catholic neighbourhoods, and we've assumed that that's because there's been more people living, members of minority communities living in working class Protestant neighbourhoods than working class Catholic neighbourhoods. But that was an assumption that was based on, you know, the data with the established minority communities up to 2001, 2, 3, 4. We've seen such radical changes in the diversity in Northern Ireland since about 2004 that I think we really have to consider questioning all our assumptions about where people are living, what their levels of interaction are. And I think this seems to throw up some questions about that.
Sorry, could I just add that for clarity, we haven't had the opportunity in this analysis to do the breakdown by educational attainment, but that data is in the NILT data set, which is freely available to all and any of you who are interested in looking at it. So it might be something that, I can't remember now who asked the question, if you want to look at that, it's there on the website. There are tables, the data is there for further analysis, and if you wanted us to help you with looking at that, we'd be more than happy for you to contact us. So.
I think the final point to come up with, the big question of why does that appear to be more prejudiced within the Protestant community? I don't know. I think that is really the question that we need to do qualitative work within that community to tease those out, to tease the nuances out, to tease the issues out, to tease the concerns out. Maybe it is people being more truthful in one community than the other. Maybe it is that they are more prejudiced, but we don't actually know why they are more. They're certainly admitting to being more prejudiced, and they're certainly admitting it across the board. And if you put that together with the data that we've had of being more incidents in Protestant working class areas, it seems to make a nice, succinct fit. But that worries me. I think. I think we need to ask people why they think. I mean, what your experience is.
Well, I ask because I actually have some students working on these issues because they were intrigued by the media portrayal of the Protestants as being more prejudiced, and I didn't know about this, so it's quite interesting to see that the data shows the same.
Yeah.
So they're trying to look at what probably can explain some of these differences in prejudice levels. So it will be interesting to see what they come up with. But a potential explanation that I was thinking of is more that just looking back into history and looking back at the early 20th centuries when there was the discourse of the Protestants was much more explicit in terms of the differences between their group and the Catholic group. So I wonder if maybe that sort of carries now into the present towards other ethnic groups. So it's that sort of openness to just admit difference rather than try to, or maybe the status related explanation. So, in terms of the Catholics sort of perceiving themselves to be of a lower status, which means it's lower status than the ethnic minority, like the same status as the ethnic minorities. Yeah. I don't know, just speculating really, but I think it's quite an interesting issue.
I think that's all we can do at the moment, speculate. And I think the fact that you've got students working on the issue, I think makes for it'd be interesting to see what you come up with.
Yeah, no, definitely. If we find anything interesting, we'll let you know.
Just to add in another conversation that other people were having about this data from Life and Times, somebody was suggesting that another explanation for the possible explanation for the differential between the Protestant community and the Catholic community in terms of their self-reported prejudice might be that because the Catholic community here had experienced discrimination and so on over a long number of years, that has made them more able to identify with other minority groups, but also might make them aware that it wouldn't be politically correct to confess prejudice. So it's quite complicated, and as Neil says, it's really something we're not fully understanding at all at the moment.
I think there is, where you've seen other areas where people who have been oppressed in the past, it doesn't necessarily make them less active as oppressors when they have a sense of power over the other. So I'd be a bit wary about going down that route, that often the oppressed become the oppressors when they have the opportunity.
Okay, another question?
I was just interested, the period of time the study was over, we've obviously seen boom and bust in terms of the economy, and I'm wondering, in a time of recession and economic downturn, is prejudice more legitimised? I'm thinking of the headlines, British jobs for British people. Do you think if we took this, in a decade's time, if we took those same 4 or 5 years, we would get the same pattern? Or do you think it's given rise to specific issues that the economic environment we're in?
I think probably the data from the 2008 data was really gathered before the recession hit. So I think you might be, when we look at the 2009 data, I think that might be when you start to see if there is anything really emerging from that. I suppose the one thing I'd say is over the first year, if you take the first year of the recession, 2008, 2009, there didn't seem to be a spike in racist incidents recorded by the police in that stage. The figures, if anything, were stable to down. But you would, I suppose the intuitive perspective is that you do see a rise in racism, prejudice, hostility to minority communities at times of economic hardship, and that you wouldn't, it's unlikely, it may not be unlikely that it may be likely that you do get to see those issues emerging over the next few while. I think the issue with the Roma, for example, last summer may have been one of those issues that was an easy target to pick on. Whereas some of the other communities are becoming more established now, and I think we maybe need to differentiate between the communities that recently arrived in Northern Ireland and those communities that are fairly established as part of the landscape here. And I'm thinking there of the British colonial migrants who are an established part of the landscape of Northern Ireland, the cultural diversity of Northern Ireland, more so than the Poles, the East Europeans, and particularly the Roma. And it may well be that the weaker groups, the easier targets, becomes the ones that get focused on, get picked on. The fact that people's perceptions of prejudice are higher towards the Poles, may be one indicator of that they're seeing understanding perceptions of prejudice higher towards those communities now.
Okay, there's a question here and then one over here.
Neil, thank you very much. Dermot Phelan, School of Law, University of Ulster. You finished off by sort of orientating us towards a policy response to the data, and that was the effective responses for anti-racism programs. And you mentioned 3 in particular, community work, education, or school, which I took to be exclusive, though I'm sure you wouldn't accept that that's the only work that needs to be done. Could I also suggest that education and those other potential pathways for programs may too be part of the problem, and we should be considering a way in which education, welfare policies, policies generally, the role of government, the practices have over a historical period of time contributed to some of the data that you show here, and that the real challenge is to name the sociological structures that give rise to it, and try to find qualitative and other data, including historical data, that helps us to interpret the numerical, the quantitative.
Mm.
And there's a gentleman here, I think.
It's just a brief comment. We've just carried out some research on the Polish community in Northern Ireland, and I think our findings was about 25% of respondents had felt victimised. So it is interesting to tie in with the view of people that there was most prejudice against Polish people. And I think in general, as the point has been raised, I think we're sort of seeing two dynamics sort of intersect at the moment. We're sort of seeing the migration context, which has changed rapidly since 2004, and I do think that the economic context, which we've discussed, is also another factor. And I do think in the next few years it will be interesting to see how that affects the findings from the similar question.
Okay. There's two more. Katrina, will we take them and then let you have a chance to respond? Bob and Paul.
Just wondering, Neil, have you been able to do any work looking at sort of, you have a couple of measures of contact with people with minority groups and then their actual sort of attitudes, and is there any sort of sign of any particular kind of link? Because you could make arguments both ways, that people might become more prejudiced if they have contact, but also quite the contrary as well.
I'm curious, this is saying there's been an increase in racism. Over the same period and with the same type of people, has there been a reduction in sectarianism?
Okay, maybe working backwards on those. Sectarianism, the police data on sectarianism is relatively static over the last 4 or 5 years since they've been gathering it. It's around 1,600 incidents a year. Attitudinal data on sectarianism, there tends to have been less work done on that. And I think there's, it's around the edges of it. Attitudes to murals, attitudes to flags, experiences of, rather than similar sorts of attitudes as that, as far as I'm aware. I don't think there's necessarily any storming increase in sectarianism, but I'd be extremely worried if there was. I think we've got quite high levels of it already without having to. In terms of the point about contact, I suppose the piece that was done by University of Ulster earlier, was it last year for OFM, the piece that was done, it did seem to suggest that contact thesis did seem to improve relationships and understandings and attitudes towards within the sectarian framework. And that's the only piece I think we've done here recently, was that it did seem to suggest that if people had contact, they were less likely to be prejudiced towards the other community, and that there was even relatively remote contact, like contact through a family member. So I think that the recent work here has suggested that the contact thesis holds up in a positive light in relation to sectarianism. I suppose we could, transpose that towards racism and hope that, there'd be a general approach. I think the other side of it, and I'd reiterate that it only takes a few relatively small number of people to cause the problems, to create tensions, to exercise the racism, and they could have the negative attitudes from contact approaches, and that could reinforce their sense of hostility. So I think you can say yes, it can work in both directions. It can generally improve people's attitudes, but it can also lead to reinforce some negative attitudes as well. And I don't think we need to be afraid of those kind of levels of contradictions that are going on there. I think that in terms of the dynamics of where we're going, I think for the last 5 years this has been an incredibly dynamic field to actually work in. We've never been able to stand on the data for more than about 6 months, and it's out of date as soon as you actually get to it and you want to start moving. We did a piece for Dell on attitudes towards migrants, which has taken a while, to get published. And I'm concerned that it's not going to be very, very up to date when it does get published. And we do need to keep on top of this issue to actually to keep it real. And we need to keep on looking at the different trends and the changing dynamics of the different communities with the economic backgrounds and so forth. Policy responses, Dermot. Yeah, I think that some of the policy you can advocate some positive policy. I would say that yes, you've got to work through the education system. You can't blame it on the kids, but you've actually got to work with the young people. You've got to work with the children. You've got to instill in them that sense of respect and tolerance and understanding right from an early age. And I think once you move into a very diverse society, or an increasingly diverse society, you've really got to put your energies into that level and working with building understanding up. I think there are problems with what policy can do or what policy actually ends up doing. That I think it's sometimes easier to take a quick fix on something than go back and look at the deep-rooted problems that you need to address and build on. But I think that's the same with any sense of policy responses, and too often, the government goes for a quick response to a situation, doesn't put in the resources into it, doesn't really sell it, doesn't really believe in it, and therefore you end up not getting, the positive responses. I think with issues of racism at the moment, we have got a fairly broad consensus that there is a problem within Northern Ireland. You don't hear too many people saying that it's not really a problem, or you don't hear too many actively racist voices in Northern Ireland compared with the situation in the UK, more generally, particularly in England and Wales. There is a consensus that we need to do something about it. We need to find some ways of doing it. There needs to be more resources into different patterns. There is work being done with the housing executive. The police have been doing work. OFM have been doing work on it. So I think there is a number of issues. It's working through the labour market, bringing the trade unions into it, which is happening, bringing the minority communities and the support groups are working. There is a general consensus, I think, about some of the things that we need to do. The issue tends to be often over resourcing and sustainability, but that's the same with a lot of the policy responses to problems. I do think, though, that if we disaggregate racism from other forms of prejudice, we're almost in a sense self-defeating, because it will be stamping on one and finding other forms of prejudice popping up. And my worry is that we kind of focusing too much on racism and think somehow that sectarianism is going to go away, it's going to disappear. It will just, I think we're kidding ourselves, and we need to look at prejudice more collectively and the experiences that we have, and only that way are we really going to get to grips with levels of racism.
Okay, is there any concluding couple of questions or comments? The gentleman first.
Thank you. I was intrigued by the relatively high percentage of people admitting and realizing that there is perception, that there is prejudice in society in general. This is interesting to compare with other cases like sexism or racism in the US, where perceptions that there is discrimination is usually treated as a sign of low prejudice. So prejudiced people would deny that there exists prejudice and discrimination. And together with the relatively high percentage also of people admitting to be prejudiced themselves, to me this suggests that a big problem is really the normative acceptability of prejudice. So it's like, yes, of course everybody knows there's prejudice, and many people are happy to say, yes, I am prejudiced. So a fundamental question would be how to address this normative acceptability, which is reproduced through media discourses, political rhetoric, and so on in our culture here.
Yeah. How long have you got? That's a big one, isn't it? I think that is the problem. I think there is a norm here that the levels of prejudice are so deep-rooted, either that it's acceptable or it's too big a problem that we can't actually really tackle it, or if we can, we shouldn't do it just yet because we've got to deal with other issues. And it would come back to this point of saying we can't disaggregate racism and sectarianism, and it's always a striking point for me how much work has been done on racism in recent years in Northern Ireland, and how little work has been done on sectarianism and our understanding of sectarianism and experiences of sectarianism. But I would agree that you've got to de-normalise it and see it as an aberration and something that's unacceptable, regardless of who that prejudice is directed towards. And it's, you know, it's going to be a long, slow process. It's got to start at the bottom. It's not, there's no quick fixes, but you work over a period of time. And to some extent, accepting Northern Ireland as a peaceful and diverse society is a relatively new concept for most people. That, you know, we're still perceived as the kind of the dual society with the Protestants and Catholic communities, the nationalists and unionists, and, you know, I think the more that the minority community has become an established political actor in small p terms, an established factor of it, then we will start to have more opportunities to challenge that prejudice in more levels, because we're recognising that there is an issue here to be addressed.
Okay, I think one last comment.
Going back to the neighbours and how many people actually report having neighbours from different ethnic minorities, I was wondering if you have in the NILT, if there is information about the neighbourhood itself, because I think I would assume that a lot of these numbers would vary by the neighbourhood that people live in. Some neighbourhoods may be more mixed, some others may, because I'm just thinking, for example, the place I live, I don't know who my neighbours are. So it might just be just a very simple sort of lack of knowledge about who your neighbours are, where they come from, especially if they're all white. For example, I doubt that the people I meet in the elevators would know that I'm Romanian myself. So to what extent is this just a lack of knowledge and a lack of sort of interest in who your neighbours are, you know, and sort of testing that compared to more like, is this a real sort of racist sort of symptom, or is this more just the way that modernity sort of happens?
Yeah, it may well be. The only thing that flags up is the patterns seem to be related in terms of there's a similar range of patterns with each minority community, which is not more distinctive based on colour and visibility of minority ethnic status than whiteness. So that if you look at the patterns, it's each one goes across the three cycles in terms of the Polish community, East European community. There's high levels of interaction with workspace and of friends, and lower at neighbourhood, and it works across all of those categories. I also think that there's increasingly few parts of Northern Ireland, few areas that don't have a minority presence now. I mean, when we did something a few years ago on looking at where the racist incidents took place, even in 2001, 2002, racist incidents were being recorded in places you thought, really? You know, there was some, you thought, okay, at that stage we thought it was the big cities, it was the larger locations. Racist incidents were recorded all kinds of places in Northern Ireland, and that's only happened increasingly over the last few years. So it may well be that there is that sense of lack of neighbourliness generally is a factor that reduces that. It may well be. But again, I think it's an issue that we need to put the flesh on rather than make too broad assumptions on it.
It's just another factor.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm going to call our discussion to a close. Thank you all for the very interesting questions, discussion.